Professor Peter Boettke, thank you so much for granting me this interview about your struggle for a better world.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It's great to be here with you.
Okay, I would like to start with the title of the book. So, The Struggle for a Better World. Let's start with the struggle, because as you said at the very beginning of the book, the struggle takes on at least three different meanings. The first one is your own struggle as a scholar. The second one is your own struggle as a citizen. And then the third one is about your struggle for liberal cosmopolitanism. I would like to leave the liberal cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan liberalism at the very end of the interview. So let's focus on the very first two meanings. So that it's a way to introduce yourself.
So I think, you know, as a scholar, we are constantly struggling to find better ways to think about, what we do as scholars, what we do as teachers. I take very seriously a claim made by a great basketball coach who was also a great educator, John Wooden. And he says, you haven't taught until they have learned. So you can't just go into the classroom and try to teach economics, and if students don't get it, blame the students. You have to look in the mirror and blame yourself for not getting the message that you think is so vital across to the students. So that means that we have to rethink, re-examine what it is that we do as teachers all the time, and we have to constantly seek to update the way we communicate basic truths in economics, because each generation has different messages that resonate with them. I don't know how many of your listeners will get this reference, but one of the things I always wanted to avoid being as a teacher, as a parent, as a coach, was always in the Peanuts cartoons. Whenever the adults talk in the Peanuts cartoons, it's just a wah, 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 and no one's listening, because the kids are not listening to what the adults have to say to them. They're listening only to the conversation they have. And I think as a parent, as a educator, we want to get people to listen to us. So there's a struggle for us in trying to be better every day. But it's also the case that as scholars, we want to ask questions. And so I've always really been influenced for many years by Richard Feynman's point that we should never worry about asking questions that we can't answer, and always worry about answers that can't be questioned. So I think the true scientific attitude is to ask questions that can't be answered. But that, of course, means that we're constantly confronting our own inability to wrestle with things. And so as scholars, we're constantly trying to figure out the human experience, how better to understand it, how better to approach the way we go tackle that. And so I think that that's also very much part of that. So those are the aspects of the scholarly teacher aspect. And then as citizen, we're constantly, trying to struggle to work well with others, to communicate and persuade our fellows about, what ideas we think will be the salvation to our social woes, trying to agitate to make sure that we live in a society that is effectively compassionate rather than just ineffectively compassionate. And so that's all part of the game too. Yeah.
Great. Better world. Now, this concept is, of course, tied to your idea of liberalism. But there are, of course, different views about the better world. So why you think that liberalism is the best, in a sense, solution or the best worldview for a better world?
So my old friend Steve Horowitz used to invoke, the Hebrew idea of repairing a broken world. That we come into this world as a broken world and we agitate to repair a broken world. And that's part of, now Steve was not a religious, not very religious person, but he was deeply Jewish. His identity and everything was connected up in that. So that Hebrew project to repair a broken world is something that, Steve could see resonating in like the project of liberalism that he had. And he had a kind of an influence on me about thinking about it that way and thinking about liberalism as an emancipatory project, which is about human freedom and dignity, working out the logical consistency of the fact that we're one another's dignified equals. These are all sort of what I mean by that, project in terms of the liberal project and the issue of liberalism there. And so it's really about recognizing the universal human rights and what are the right institutional environment that consistently can derive from our notion of rights to provide the good consequences of a thriving economy of peace and prosperity and generalized prosperity. So economics was never about benefiting the privileged and the powerful, but always about unleashing the least advantaged and most vulnerable through freedom and giving them an opportunity to get dignity. McCloskey, in her book on the bourgeois, in the bourgeois trilogy, argues about the connection between liberty and dignity. And her argument is that, the long fought battle for liberties, right, is taking place over centuries, and it's hard fought. There are only marginal victories against, oppression, but each little victory makes way for other victories. But her argument is that when we afforded dignity to certain activities, that in combination with liberty is what generates the great fact. So it's like the liberties are being accumulated, but then once we afforded dignity to commerce and enterprise and whatnot, that's when everything. And so it's this issue of the thinking about through, we're one another's dignified equals. What does that mean? For the way we live, for the way that we tolerate, for the way that we love, all of those kind of questions. So yeah, that's what I mean by that.
Okay, I'd like to come back on liberty a little bit later, so I will raise some further question about liberty. Let's focus now on the nexus between liberalism and democracy.
Yeah.
You cite Mises about democracy, so you claim together with him and other liberal thinkers that liberalism is intimately connected with democracy. So could you explain why this connection is so much important for both, or I would say for liberalism first and for democracy itself?
So it's so we're sitting here in the Don Lavoie room, and I'm right across from you, but right behind you here is Vincent Ostrom's book, The Meaning of Democracy and the Vulnerabilities of Democracies. And if you go to the beginning of that book, what Vincent Ostrom argues in there, which is in many ways his crowning book, it summarizes his whole philosophy of social science and of political economy. What he goes in the beginning is he says that if we limit democracy to one person, one vote, then that's not gonna get us majority. One person, one vote, majority rule. That's a very limited notion of democracy.
But is it because it's a mere procedural conception?
Yeah, it's just
of
purely
right.
and instead what we need to do is view of democracy as the way we treat one another, that we treat one another in democratic ways, that we see one another as citizens, that we see one another as natural equals, no hierarchies. Right, that we come into conversation with one another and we're one another's dignified equals. That's a democratic way of thinking. Now, so therefore it becomes in many ways synonymous with liberalism, right? And so I don't want to pull a trickery, right, where I'm just using the same words to mean, different words to mean the same thing. But that's kind of, where we're headed at in this way of thinking about democracy. But why does Mises put so much stress on democracy? Well, he puts so much stress on it in the sense that it's connected to that, but then also this procedural democracy is the only way in which we can resolve our differences peacefully. And so it's peace that Mises is the driving idea, and democracy and putting up to voting and turn taking, basically. Your side won this time, I'll win next time. So, where democracy breaks down, the vulnerabilities of democracy is when the political becomes a kind of a part of a permanent winning coalition. That can happen because of various social cleavages, like, say, for example, the establishment of apartheid system in South Africa, which is quote unquote democratic, but not really democratic because the half of the population that's being enslaved doesn't have a vote, or being oppressed doesn't have a vote. And so what Mises is talking about is that the liberal always relies on democracy rather than constraining democracy, precisely because they believe that the only way in which these ideas can work is if we give the free rein of idea competition, that you win out, because you can't have liberalism at the point of a sword or at the point of a gun, right? So so again, you would knock out the idea of authoritarian liberalism, right? That like the good king imposes the liberal order on everyone else, because what we really care about is this ideas. And so in that sense, it's very McCloskey-esque, again, because you need to have a groundswell of support of the idea that we're one another's dignified equals, that we deserve our elbow room to live our lives as we choose, to love who we like as we choose, to pursue our projects as we choose.
But in this case, of course, we need to have this kind of recognition from, at least at the constitutional level, of this kind of rights. Otherwise, democracy can always violate them.
Yeah.
So it's a liberal democratic project for the very simple reason, as far as I've understood, that of course the majority, from a procedural point of view, can do whatever they want, but they can't violate this kind of dignified rights that you are talking about.
So I apologize if I didn't clarify that.
No.
That's it. No. I mean, that's 100% right. That the right of the majority is always constrained by the rights of the minority, right? And so this is one of the things that people misunderstand about Buchanan, when he's obsessed with the notion of political externalities. I mean, like obsessed with it, and wants to hammer it home to all of his intellectual interlocutors that you need to worry about the question of political externalities, because as he put it, and then his student and independent thinker Richard Wagner, my former colleague here at George Mason, he just retired last year, and we miss him dearly in our interactions. But Dick always used to say, following Buchanan, that the magic number in markets is 2, but the magic number in politics is 3, because the 2 can get together to defeat the 1, right? And the way Dick describes it was interesting. Maybe you want to pursue this. Is his argument is that Pareto, who was very much a developer of market logic and all of that stuff, Pareto eventually switched out of economics and into sociology, writing The Mind and Society, 4 volumes. And the way Dick puts it is that after Pareto got done working out all the optimality conditions and everything like that and figuring out mutually beneficial exchange, he then said, well, in a world where we have, 2 wolves and 1 lamb, the lamb looks like a pretty good dinner to the wolves. And so economics doesn't explain how I could get an exchange out of that. What it does is I have to go to sociology, right? And to explain power and all the other things. And so Wagner did that as well, but he calls it entangled political economy rather than sociology. But that's what, Wagner got into. But it was basically this magic number of politics is 3. The way I think about it is different than that. It says the same thing in the end. But I following, Riker and the theory of political coalitions, standard public choice kind of line of reasoning, I always think of politics as about minimum winning coalitions. So what's the minimum winning coalition that I can have to get my politics through? And that's what makes for strange bedfellows in politics and all this stuff like that. But the key issue is, as long as you feel that the coalitions are constantly shifting, then you can actually have like a democratic deliberation, because you don't feel you can lose today, but you'll win tomorrow. But if you feel that you can never ever win because there's a thumb put on the scale by the state, or there's blockages to your ability to express your voice, or whatnot in the system, then you have a real problem with democratic politics. And so this is where I think a lot of the interesting questions today come in. But so I see, so Mises and Hayek, they're very much committed to this idea of peace, you know. And so one way I like to think
Because
about
they lived the
yeah, they lived
times
in
of
those. Yeah.
wars.
So the way I like to think about our project, and you can, you know, put me off on this too, but the way I tend to think about the project is as follows, which is Kant laid out this dream of an idea of perpetual peace. And one of the things that economists have tried to do in this political economy is how do you institutionalize the quest for perpetual peace? What institution could actually generate that?
Well,
Because most of human history, we're at each other's throats.
Yeah.
So how is it that we could get peace? So anyway, sorry, I
this is an
flattered on too
interesting
long. Yeah.
point. State intervention, chapter 5 of your book.
Yeah.
But the chapter starts with this question. You raise the question: is intervention inevitable?
Yeah.
But I would like to shift the focus of the question slightly. That is, don't you think that the debate between libertarians and egalitarians has been too much polarized by the market versus state dichotomy, or individual versus state? I'm asking this because, as you know, one of your two main reference point, Ostrom and North,
Yeah.
have long warned against this kind of, looking at the world through the lenses of this dichotomy.
Yeah. So great question. I have my biases that probably come through, I should say, in this book, that these are essays, and these are not really like research papers. They're speeches. Almost all of them are speeches that I had the opportunity to give to various different organizations throughout the 2000s. Some of them are speeches that are of more of a pure scholarly nature, in which it's a scholarly community, but they're not original research. They're summaries of research that's done elsewhere that's embedded. So like my presidential address to the Southern Economic Association on economics and public administration is based on a lot of research that, you know, me and my colleagues have done. I try to summarize it in that speech and whatnot. But others of the speeches in here are more like, you know, this is the theme of the conference. Could you give a, you know, overview and whatnot? To give the keynote and the overview of it. And so this one was one in you know, is state intervention inevitable? And so it's the idea of the logic of public choice, you know, squashing over any other efforts at liberalization, because, you know, once businesses are given, you know, the freedom, one of the things that they do is they coalesce as long as the government is giving out favors to then get the favors and go from there. Now, that's an empirical reality. We look out the window and we see it, and then the question is do you respond, let's say, the way I might respond, or do you respond, say, the way that, say, Jeff Hodgson might respond? And, you know, there's two different ways that you would think about the rise of this new sort of privileged class or political capitalism or whatever that you want to call it. So to me, I think one of the things that we want to do is we want to make the market, and this is anti-Lin in some sense, we want to make the market, this is a normative point, almost hermetically sealed off from the state, because anytime that you unleash the market, unleash the state with the market, the state's going to corrupt the market. Now, I'll tell you a little story. I'm at a conference at the LSE with my good friend Pete Leeson, and it happened to be a conference that was pretty star-studded, put together by Tim Besley. But Schleifer is there, and Ann Kruger is there, Esther Duflo is there, and, you know, a lot of very big hitters. Esther Duflo was there before she was really like Esther Duflo, right? I mean, so she was very young, but you know, rising star, but not yet quite like who she later became. But I gave my paper. It was a joint paper with Pete, and Ann Kruger commented, and she said, no offense to my good George Mason friends, but we all know that what we really need is a thriving market economy that is governed by reasonable regulation that's not capturable by interests. So that's a key word right there, right? Reasonable regulation, not capturable by interest. And, I waited a second, and then I responded, and I said, what if that's a null set? And, everyone sort of stared at me. And Schleifer, to break up the tension, said, well, you so unreasonable. And then everyone laughed, and then everyone forgot. But to this day, no one's given me an answer. So, I'll give you an example. During the financial crisis, the Fed decided it would have regulatory control over the big banks that they had just given investment houses that they just, bailed out. So this woman, Karma Sagaria, she left, her job as a lawyer to go work as a regulator. Mm-hmm. And she was frustrated because she found out that they weren't overseeing anything. They were, in fact, working in cahoots with Goldman Sachs and her own. And so she brought in her iPhone and put it on record and hid it in her pocketbook and recorded 5 hours of tape that you can listen to on NPR anywhere you want, Carmen Sagaria, and she wrote a book about this, about how it is that basically the Fed and all of its desire to regulate, which is new authorities for the Fed, ended up by being captured by the very people they were trying to oversee. Talk about network economies. We have hearings and we bring, all the big networks. We bring Mark Zuckerberg to Washington, D.C. He has to trade in his hoodie and put on a suit for the first time. And, he sits down there in front of Congress and they talk about having regulatory oversight. And he says, I volunteer to be on the committee that will help regulatory oversight for our industry. And they're like, oh my God, what a citizen, what a wonderful volunteer. And I, of course, am sitting there saying, yeah, no joke, right? Of course he's going to do that. Now, I understand that position that I have is perhaps overly cynical, and it's also perhaps maybe, even one might say dogmatic about markets versus state. And so I don't think there's any harm of me holding that position as long as it's constantly checked, meaning not by myself, but by other people. And so I, in good faith, put out my position as strongly as I can, inviting the criticisms of, now Eleanor's not with us anymore, but or Vincent, but of Jeff and others. And I have so much to share in common with Jeff about a desire, as you'll notice. I mean, with the Liberal Project, I see the Liberal Project as part of a solidarity project. So liberal cosmopolitanism and liberal solidarity, in my mind, are not in conflict with each other, right? I would like to have a more participatory citizenry which checkmated any efforts at privilege and power relations and things like that. So I want to empower democratic processes, but I also think that a lot of the most effective democratic processes are in the non-political sector, the non-market and non-politics, meaning civil society, citizenries, right? And citizens banding together in groups, which is also what Elinor looked at. So I'll tell you one last funny story about the Ostroms. So I was invited to give a talk out at IU in the 90s, and I was working on transition economies at the time. And the title of my talk is the transition to the market too important to be left to the market? This was a kind of a question at the time, that we had to sort of somehow manage the transition to the market by the state. State had to manage it. And I was like, no, you need to unleash the market. State needs to get out of the way. And so I go in there to give my talk, and Vincent was a stickler for terms. And he had this big walking stick. And I start out and I say, the market, and he bangs his stick and says, what do you mean by the market? And so then I'm like, the nexus of voluntary exchanges? What do you mean by voluntary? I couldn't get anywhere. And so then I said, well, how about I move on to the other one? I mentioned the state. What do you mean by the state? And so, I couldn't, the talk, I had a great time. I love both Vincent and Elinor Ostrom to death. I wrote a book about the Ostroms, and we gave them an award here, and before the whole rest of the world paid attention to Lynn and everything. But they were she wasn't not but he was a stickler for terms, and boy, he just kept hammering at you because he didn't like dichotomization. Intellectually, I think that they're right, that this is a Wagner point about it's not dichotomized, it's entangled, and all these things. So, but I think that that's a positive social science view. When I look out the window and I see the world, it's entangled. But when I normally think about how we might fix the problems of an entangled world, go back to the other one, how you can repair a broken world. The world's broken because it's entangled, right? And in my opinion, right? Which is again, and so therefore one of the ways to normatively think about it is how can I, leave on to, as Jesus says, leave on to Caesar's what is Caesar's and leave on to God what is God, is how you can maybe demarcate these lines where the state should have no influence in our interaction.
This is also why you share, in some sense, with Geoff the idea, well, the problem of the crony capitalism.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's
I mean,
perfectly clear.
It's so what it is. It's the rise of mercantilism. So this is again is the other thing to remember is that the history of economics was born in a critique of a powerful and privileged system, not a defense of it. Like if Adam Smith was really in favor of the powerful and the privileged, he would have defended mercantilism rather than criticize it. And so I think that the whole way in which we framed that the left, if I can use that term, if the left has framed economics is totally backwards, right? The economics is actually the greatest tool for the left. If we think about the left as the ones who are against power and privilege.
That's right. Okay, I want to get to the core of your book, that is liberty and equality. There is this statement, I read it, your ideal, is a system absent of all privileges.
Yeah.
So the vision of the good society that I hope to convey is one envisioned by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations when he wrote of the liberal program of equality, liberty, and justice. Now these three key concepts, equality, liberty, and justice, have somewhat defined modernity. But Smith's understanding of them might be different from ours, of course, and they obviously mean different things to different people. So let's try to be more precise, also because Hayek, that you quote himself, exhorted to update our language to match the challenges of our times.
Yeah.
So freedom, first word. How do you define freedom and why freedom is so important in your view of the good society?
So I define freedom as absence of coercion.
Truly a Hayekian.
Yeah. So absence of, another way to put it, which is related to this theme, is absence of arbitrary, claims to hierarchy, right? Like, that I am superior to you. I have a visceral reaction, which probably goes to my youth, just against. People arbitrarily claiming that they are better than others. So any system, any way in which you have that kind of effort to try to impose that on others is something that I find abhorrent. And so at a philosophical level, I think just simply the absence of coercion would be the way I would define it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
But there is one issue that I've been thinking about for quite a while, and especially recently, is I found it interesting. That is the problem that Buchanan raised in his Afraid to be Free, Dependency as Desideratum. You devote an entire chapter to this, and I think it's, at least to me, it's one of the most intriguing questions for liberalism. Let me explain you why. Because Buchanan once wrote in another paper, man wants freedom to become the man he wants to become. So he was rather, I would say, optimistic about that. So he seems to believe that men really want freedom. Now, in Afraid to be Free, Dependency as Desideratum, he writes, let me read it, it's a long quote, but I really love this.
No, go ahead.
So, the thirst or desire for freedom and responsibility is perhaps not nearly so universal as so many post-Enlightenment philosophers have assumed. What share of persons in varying degrees of bondage, from slavery to ordinary wage salary contracts, really want to be free, with the accompanying responsibility for their own choices? And he keeps on saying, the lacuna in classical liberalism, Buchanan pointed out, lies in its failure to offer a satisfactory alternative to the socialist collectivist thrust that reflects the pervasive desire for the parental role of the state. For persons who seek, even if unconsciously, dependence on the collectivity, the classical liberal argument for independence amounts to negation. So my question is, what should liberals do to address this big issue? I mean, to put it another way, or the way I see it, how can we move from fear of freedom to freedom from fear?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer. Remember what I said before? We should never
No,
fear.
you have an answer in your book that is
yeah.
mainly community,
but
caring community.
Yeah, yes, I do say that we want to live in, basically, participate in a prosperous market economy and live in caring communities. So but what I mean by that is that these questions that Buchanan raises are often very difficult ones to sort of wrestle your way through, which is why he's such an interesting thinker for people, and why, trying to pigeonhole him is so wrong-headed and also tragic. Let me just tell you a little story about him as a teacher. I had three great, I have a devoted teacher, Don Lavoie, who was an assistant professor when I was working with him. And this room that we're sitting in is named after Don. And the influence in all of these books is an effort, these pictures and everything is an effort to capture the influences and the whatnot that played into Don over the years. But I also studied with Gordon Tullock, Kenneth Boulding, and Jim Buchanan, who are like royalty in economics, but always like slightly out of sync economists, but nevertheless, royalty, a Nobel Prize winner, a distinguished fellow of the AEAs, the second John Bates Clark Medal winner. These kind of people are significant scholars, and I experienced them, as a 20-something, sitting there watching them and learning from them. And I will tell you the following: Buchanan never ended a class without asking a question. Tullock never ended the class without making a declaration. And there's a difference between those two, mentally and in the attitude. Boulding, it was just the sheer joy of scholarship as well as the sense of urgency. So it was this kind of weird mix of both. I just love what I'm doing, and what we're doing is so urgent because he was a peace studies person. So and those issues. But now related to your question about freedom. So the reason why I bring that up is just because as I was doing these essays in the 2000s. Buchanan's stock, Buchanan's stock since I've graduated has probably risen more than any other economist or economic thinker in my mind. And I had a very, very high estimation of him when I was a student of his. But as I read more and I wrestled with things having to do with the transition economies and whatnot, his way of framing questions and asking questions became more profound than I ever thought. In 1992, he went to Moscow, and he came back and he said, Russia's going to have a real hard time in transition, before anyone. And he said the reason is because you can do all the institutional reforms that you want, but what matters is the tacit presuppositions of political economy. So people have experienced a market for 40 years there, right? And they see the market as like the black market. That's what they see. So it's a market like as if we had it in our country, that the only market we knew was the ticket scalper to get into like a game that we wanted to see or something like that. And so they're able to dictate the terms of control of exchange. We would like to get in. We're willing to pay the higher price, but when we look at the ticket and it costs $12 and we know that we paid $50 to get in, we're kind of looking at it and we're like, all right, I want to get in the game, but damn, like that was, and so that's how they view the market. That experience is not going to be overturned just by saying private property rights. And so he argued that there was a whole other set of stuff that had to go on. He started talking about cultural attitudes and things like that, but this is, before anyone. So this is where this transition comes in. So in the essay, so let me, one of the things that I did is I went through these different things. I'd be given these assignments, at these societies. And what I do is I'd say okay, so Buchanan has these tensions in say 3 papers. And I want to see if I can figure out a way to reconcile Buchanan's different bites of the apple, of a question in these kind of papers or whatever, and that led to the way I kind of wrote a lot of these lectures that I gave or speeches that I gave that show up in this book. So Buchanan writes in the essay, "Man wants liberty to become the man he wants to become." This is his aspirational aspect of man. Note that that is a totally different idea than Homo economicus, right? Which is a key thing. So the economic actor. So as a student, one of the best questions Buchanan asked us was, who is the individual in economics? Who is the individual that we study in economics, right? Which is what's being asked in Natural and Artifactual Man, which it's not Becker and Stigler and de Gustibus, right? Because we strive to be something better. We fake it until we make it, right? And that's what leads to entrepreneurship and all these other kind of things like that. So man wants liberty to become the man he wants to become. Then he comes along and he says, but maybe we're afraid to be free, right? So then, we want liberty to become the man we want to become, but maybe what we really want is we want a downside protection on our failure to become who it is we want to become. So we would like to become who we want to become, but we want to have a downside bet in case we fail, and when we fall, we're going to have like some kind of thing here. Well, what's the implications of that? And that's the afraid to be free. Now, the problem with that, afraid to be free, is now I'm mixing people, but the Ostroms, what their whole project is for a self-governing democratic citizenry, we have to, as Vincent says, take on the Tocquevillian idea of the cares of thinking and the troubles of living. And unless we are prepared as citizens, capable as citizens, right, to, in fact, deal with the cares of thinking and the troubles of living, man, we're not going to be able to have a democratic society, because we won't be the citizenry that can handle the subsidiarity, right? The whole point about their polycentricism is to try to match the decision unit of government with the externality that has to be dealt with, right? And so, again, garbage collection at the local level, national defense maybe at a more super, national level or whatever, and it's subsidiarity all the way down. Well, we need to have citizens seen like a citizen, as opposed to seen like synoptically like the state, requires that the citizens want to see. And so Buchanan's coming along and saying, well, what happens when the citizens don't want to see? And they turn to the synoptic and they say, big brother, look out for us, right? And at that point, then we can no longer have the kind of self-governing democratic society that is, this vibrant idea. Now, yeah, I mean,
this is the tacit presupposition. I mean, in the sense, or can be interpreted, at least in the sense that there is something that the liberal state cannot guarantee. This is known, at least among legal scholars, as the Balkan Paradox, because it's something that the state cannot guarantee, even though it needs this kind of sense of autonomy.
Yeah.
Because without it, you cannot build up either the subsidiarity you were talking about, or and the only thing a liberal can do is to preach.
Yeah.
So it's to say, look, it's better if you are, or if you tend or aspire to be a little bit autonomous and not ask for dependency from the state and so forth. So this is, I think, a real challenge for liberalism, because it's, and I think Buchanan saw it very well.
Yeah, and go back to my first answer to your question about teaching. So think about, I went to college in 1978, okay? So what was going on in 1978? Go back 4 years when I entered high school in 74, right? So, I become aware, let's say, in middle school about politics. So what's going on? Agnew is being, arrested for corruption and kicked out of being vice president of the United States. By the way, we didn't claim democracy was going to fail then. He just, was arrested, could no longer be, the vice president of the United States. But, we had the whole problems with the Vietnam War. We had the problems with the welfare state. New York City was bankrupt and it was falling apart. And so all these things are going on, and Nixon then is kicked out of office. Saturday Night Live comes on the TV. It makes fun of politicians. It never exalts politicians. All it does is exalt them, whether or not they're right or left. It's like the whole thing was just to attack it. you know, and everything like that. So I grew, and then the stagflation was going on outside the window. So like I went to college, and my tacit presuppositions were never to think like, oh, I need to turn to the state for my solutions, because the state was the reason why we had all the problems. But now consider that today. What have these kids grown up? To them, communism is like a Charlie Chaplin film. So what they think is that, oh, 9/11, bad people blew up buildings, so therefore we need the state to help us from terrorism. So we acquiesce to the TSA and the surveillance state because they keep us safe, right? And then the global financial crisis happens, and you know, oh, we need someone to protect our pensions. We need someone to protect us from the vagaries of the market. And then the pandemic happens, and oh my God, we need someone to protect us from health. And so their tacit presuppositions is that the state is this necessary thing to save us from the vagaries of life. So my tacit presuppositions is the state is the cause of war, poverty, and lack of opportunity. The state needs to get the hell out. Now, teach me economics. What am I going to get out of economics? I mean, just any economics, right? What am I going to get out of it? Let alone the type of economics I was taught, but like, what are you, right? Versus now trying to teach kids economics. And, you know, and they're going to see and hear different things, right? And that's, I think, you know, a crucial aspect of, you know, what we're struggling with. But let's go to the philosophical level, and then just let me respond at a philosophical level to you. Buchanan has another essay. It's, you know, Buchanan always used alliteration, you know, calculus of consent, democracy and deficit, you know, these kind of titles, politics by principle, you know, these kind of like catchy titles. So this is actually one of his worst titled essays, but it's one of his most profound. It's called The Potential and Limits of Socially Constructed Humankind, right? That's a mouthful, and he never had mouthfuls, but that was one of his talks. And in it, what he says is that by the end of the 19th century, liberalism, classical liberalism, economic liberalism, political economy, had realized for us the greatest autonomy that human history had ever achieved, the greatest prosperity that human history had ever achieved, and we had a period of peace, which was unlike earlier periods where we were constantly at war with the religious wars and things like that. He says, but what we were missing was a theory of justice. So classical liberalism, despite giving the autonomy, general prosperity, and peace, was actually deemed as unjust because we didn't have a theory of justice that fit up. So now the question is, for our modern times, can we actually have a theory of justice? You know, and this relates to what you were talking about before. And this is, again, put on the table with all of the stuff having to do with income inequality and the great disparities. And also, you know, so I always say that we suffer really serious problems in the United States. I think Europe is even worse. But the United States suffers these serious problems of what's going to be the end game of our monetary institutions, in which we've given extraordinary powers to the Fed rather than reining them back in. What's going to be the issue with the fiscal crisis that's associated with promissory politics, in which we've made fiscal commitments in the future, which are going to be difficult for us to actually pay for, given any kind of set of scenario of assumptions that we have. And then finally, structural inequality that we're seeing. So we can't have a rise of the rent-seeking state, which is fueling the fiscal problem as well as the monetary problem, and also not see it have damaging consequences on the structural inequalities in America, because the whole point of the rent-seeking state is to give privileges to certain people. So again, you're gambling with other people's money. So you know, the whole Wall Street Occupy movement, it has resonation, because what did we do? We actually bailed out the rich, you know, and who? By you know, and so this is an unjust system.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I had a question at propos of this problem of equality, because well, it's clear that your is classic liberal position that can be traced back to Adam Smith, and I started, you know, citing this question about the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. So let's discuss a little bit of equality, because it seems to be less important, I would say, for you compared to liberty, at least in the sense that you endorse a notion of equality as equality before the law, that is the main notion. So, and there is a passage I would like to cite: liberalism is a doctrine of economic, this is you, is a doctrine of economic and political life grounded in the recognition that we are one another's dignified equals, and that justice demands equal treatment of equals. Now, my question is, don't you think that justice might, at least sometimes, also demand unequal treatment of unequals, or if this is already a way to introduce into state and politics some kind of discrimination or privilege for someone else? Because, of course, if you treat people, if you have to discriminate, so to say, and treat people in an unequal way to realize a little bit more of equality, that might introduce a problem of privileges, rent-seeking, or...
Yeah, I think so that would be my answer when I wrote the book, similar to what you just said there. But I guess goes back to my earlier struggle thing. And also there's a quote from Hayek that's repeated throughout the book about how each generation has to restate these truths because they need to resonate with the new generation. So McCloskey, at the conference that you and I were at, I think made a very important advance in the way we should think about things, because rather than saying equality of opportunity, we should simply say equality of permission, that no one has to seek, gets more permission than another person to do anything, right? And so we need to have permissionless innovation. And I think that McCloskey, by putting it on this issue of permission, puts the relationship between the citizen and the state, I think, in a very interesting light. So we are now, so the way that Buchanan thought about this, and the way that Levy and Pert talk about it in their book about Buchanan and the Virginia School Project, was they refer to it as towards an economics of natural equals. So if we treat one another like Adam Smith suggests, that the only difference between the street porter and the philosopher is in the mind of the philosopher, and instead we are natural equals, dignified equals with one another, then that phrase, by the way, that I'm using, that you mentioned, the one another's dignified equals, that comes from the political philosopher, legal philosopher, Jeremy Waldron, in his book on one another's equals. I like Jeremy Waldron a lot. He's decidedly an intellectual on the left, but I've learned a ton from him through the years, and I try to listen to him. And he has a great book called Political Theory, which he thinks of differently than I would, but to me, I'm like, yep, that's right. We need to have a political theory which actually has a realistic theory of politics. Not an idealized theory of politics, but real life and blood politics, which then goes back to the earlier thing about minimum winning coalitions. So how is it that once you have that theory of political theory in your political reality, in your political theory, how that changes? But anyway, Jeremy Waldron, I think, is someone who everyone should read and learn from a lot. And so I try to, read whatever and listen to whatever he has to say. And I'm trying to incorporate that idea, but fit it into my liberal, as I understand it, project. So this is, can we, rather than deep philosophy, maybe I can summarize it by saying that I think that the liberal project, as I envision it, or what McCloskey is translating McCloskey's project into, that is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if just given the elbow room, whereas other people think of extraordinary people, the elite, right, can do extraordinary things if only given the power. And so if you think about the response to the pandemic, those two ideas get floated around, but only one of them dominates, which is we're going to give extraordinary power to the extraordinary elites to sort of save us from things, as opposed to, say, an alternative way we could have approached it is unleash the entrepreneurial spirit so that decentralized mechanisms of providing safety and whatnot could be unleashed. Providing economic activity, but yet also safe economic activity. We're providing schools, but also safe delivery of schools. And the idea is that we can't do that. So therefore we must squash it with monopoly expertise, right? And as a result of doing that, you suppressed in many ways the kind of entrepreneurial discoveries that might have actually been tackle a global pandemic. But we argued that the externality was too big, and maybe it was. But and so I'm asking us to think about the counterfactual. Maybe it's thankful that we didn't do the counterfactual. Maybe it would have been much worse. But we can't assume that counterfactual would have been much worse. We have to engage in thought experiments as intellectuals, struggle and think about ways and sort of find evidence, because counterfactuals are really, really hard, right, to examine. But yet that's actually what we're always dealing with in the social sciences. Yeah.
Let me open a very short parenthesis. Well, perhaps I should have said this at the very beginning, because there is something of this book, or well, rather of your own way of studying things that is really astonishing, that I really loved. That is your capacity of really dialoguing and reading, and, or to cite McCloskey, really listening everybody. You were citing Waldron, so you were really reading, and I mean, it's an amazing exercise in intellectual struggle to deal with different opinion coming from the left, even the extreme left, or so. This is something that it's really clear in your book, but in other books of yours.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but that's all from the way I was trained by Don Lavoie. He, he very much did not allow you to be trapped in the dogmatism. It's because he cared so much about the project of Austrian economics and this broader liberal political economy, radical liberal political economy, that his emphasis was always on being, treating other arguments in the strongest possible sense, and then also looking at our own weaknesses as scabs that should be exposed, that we want to scratch and tear open so that the healing could be. It was very eye-opening to work with him.
That's great.
And it's also the attitude that Buchanan had. I mean, again, despite, Buchanan was, I remember Buchanan chastising me because I didn't, read, this book by this Marxist woman, and he asked me about it, and I didn't know about it, and he chided me on not knowing it, and that was like the way that they. Here's the other thing that's interesting. Buchanan, Don didn't do this, but Buchanan did, which was, if you went into his office, he always had the Times Literary Supplement there, right? And so he was always reading like what was going on in the general intellectual culture. And as a result of that, I also, for years, and I still to this day am a subscriber, but I was a faithful reader of the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Economist magazine, because, in many ways, Buchanan kind of alerted me to these things as being like easy tools to be abreast of what was the current cultural zeitgeist in America, in Europe, and then among the basically technocratic elite. So I view the economists as technocratic elite. I view the TLS as the kind of literary culture of Europe and like, what's going on there. And then New York Review of Books is like the Upper West Side of Manhattan and what the intellectual elites, at Columbia or whatever are doing.
It's, it was something that I really loved, and it's, you can see it in the book, everywhere in the book, I would say. So this is a really good exercise of, and also a lesson. If you want to be a true liberal, you really have to, confront with different ideas. So
yeah, I mean, you know this from your interviews with Jeff, but and Jeff has these, 3 amazing books, right? So the one of them is The Wrong Turnings, and then he has the book on the feasibility of socialism, and then he has the book on liberal solidarity. In The Wrong Turnings, it's mainly a book directed at his colleagues on the left. But at the end, he has this open letter to like his colleagues on the right, and in a weird way, and he might not agree with that, you might not agree, but like I read those letters and I was thinking to myself, like I could write those letters, like, right, because I'm against the militaristic interpretation of the liberal ideal. I'm always worried about militarism. I'm worried about the imperialist project. I'm worried about the corruption through crony capitalism. All those kind of things that Jeff is attuned to, and he's trying to warn the Hayeks or whatever. The issue that I have is one that's first of all, it's a human issue, which is I do and I don't mean it to be excusing anyone. People live their lives, they make mistakes, and I'm sure that they have regrets. Everyone does, at the end of the day, right? But Friedman and Hayek and Buchanan, Buchanan went to Chile for a Mont Pelerin meeting, and he gave a talk there about limited government, and he's quoted in the newspaper at condemning the people that were at the meeting and that he had met that thought that having an authoritarian dictator to promote liberalism was an acceptable answer. So it's not like he sat there and said like, yay, going us. Friedman's discussions are that, Friedman was asked to talk about what causes inflation. He says, you double the money supply, you're going to double the price level. Don't double the money supply. Then he goes to China, and they ask him the same thing. Double the money supply, you double the price level. If he was in an airport in Newark, New Jersey, right, they would have said, how do you stop inflation? He'd say, double the money supply, double the price level. And so don't double the money supply. So, Friedman was just being a doctor to the world. And as he always points out, no one ever says, oh, my God, Friedman went to China and gave advice to China. He gave a talk in Chile. He actually, was in China, like that. He spent all 40 minutes giving a talk in Chile. And somehow, people like, Naomi Klein or whatever want to make it to be a whole thing. And Jeff, brings that up. Because he's like, why are you trucking? And this is the new book also with, with Brad DeLong, right? Where he tries to see this, somehow these liberals all condemn their views because they aligned with other people. But like I've always said to Brad, which doesn't get a good response, is that, Brad actually worked in the administration, right, where they dropped bombs on people and killed, hundreds of thousands of people. Is he responsible because he gave advice on economics to an administration that also happened to be involved in efforts to bomb, people in the Middle East or whatever? No, I don't think so. He gave economic advice. That's what he was asked to do, right? And so I think that this is, people like myself, as far as I know, Jeff, we've never been in a position where we, wanted to offer advice to political leaders. Instead, we stand outside the system. I don't even vote, and it's not because of public choice reasons. It's because when I was a kid, I was really involved in sports. And when I decided that I wanted to be an academic, I recognized to myself, I said, hey, if you're an academic, you need to be more like an impartial referee in a game, not like a player in the game. So what you're going to do is, that was my attitude at the time. So you can't be on one of the teams. If you're on a team, in our context, team red or team blue, you're going to call the game wrong. So what you have to do is you have to stand outside of it. And so, now, but at the same time, I'm like a political junkie. I watch, political news like it's crazy, and whatnot. But I'm not a registered Republican. I'm not a registered Democrat. I'm not a registered Libertarian. I want to have some kind of distance. And Jeff and I, I think we have that shared distance. So as a result of that, we can condemn the people that are, like that. But is it fair for us to condemn them? I think sometimes yes, when you are complicit in acts of evil, you should be held accountable for acts of evil. When you are just happen to be in the proximity of evil, that's different. And when you remain silent in the face of evil, what does that mean? And I think today we in the modern discourse, silence is complicitly, and I don't know if that's correct. I think it's kind of weird because there's 1,001 things that are going wrong in the world at any one time, and so I can't comment on what's wrong with everything all the time. So I don't know. I mean, that's a kind of a
big issue.
crappy answer, actually. But my view is that Jeff has these 3 books. He has this open letter. I listen seriously to what he has to say in the content of the 3 books and in the open letter, and I don't want to be held responsible for the misstatements of earlier generations of people who I've been influenced by. I only want to be responsible for the statements that I have to say about these things. And so I'm inviting that criticism, on me rather than tagging me with something that someone said in 1927 or someone said in 1973 or or whatever, right? And so I have regrets of things I've said, about in the transition period or whatever, and what the priorities should be, and I would rethink back, and I was probably a little too confident about privatization, especially by the nomenclatura, which I thought was one way you could overcome the transitional gains trap in East and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, was to give control rights to the people, give cash flow rights to the people who currently have control rights, the de facto owners of things. And that's privatization by the nomenclatura. And I didn't expect them, naively, to turn around and then use that economic power to protect their status through political power, which is the oligarchs in Russia. Right? So I'm pretty sure that all the alternative privatization methods might not have worked. So giving the buyouts to the existing rent holders was one way to do realpolitik in privatization, but it sowed the seeds for the oligarchs, which has now condemned the entire privatization process. Yeah. But so, but you still have to solve the transitional gains trap problem from Tulloch to get the reforms in the first place. And so it's unclear to me how you could do that if you are addressing your way to the existing structure. So the way I would think about it now, more McCloskey-like, is what we should have done is stressed the entry conditions, right? So we should have stressed not so much fixing the rent holders, but instead making sure that permission was never something that was differential, and instead that you would have entry so that technology would erode the monopolistic power of the existing, say, state enterprises, and that they would be eroded in their market power over time. Maybe that might have been a more powerful way to do transition. Clearly, we screwed up transition, and so you have to think about what it is that we did wrong in that, and what we've learned over the last 30 years after the collapse of communism, because we've had moments where it worked, and we've had moments where extreme authoritarianism has come back, right-wing populism has come back. I mean, who would have ever expected Hungary would have Viktor Orban, right? Like that. Not that. If you go back to the 80s, you never would have expected that they would have a Viktor Orban. Why would you expect the Czech Republic, not to have another Václav Havel, but instead end up by having right-wing populist, kind of movements? And so it's something that we'll puzzle over and struggle again to figure out. And I think it invites tremendous questions for us in political economy.
To conclude, 2 questions.
Yeah,
No, that's okay. 2 questions about the future. So I'm referring here to the last 2 chapters of the book. The penultimate chapter is about your being pessimistically optimistic about the future. So I would like to have an explanation of this tension between pessimism and optimism. And the last, I would say, question is about your cosmopolitan liberalism that we mentioned at the very beginning. And let me cite this passage. It is, in the extreme, The position I maintain is that of true radical liberalism, that citizenship would reflect the entire planet. So the cosmopolitan liberal ideal is that we are strangers nowhere in this world. So this is your very last struggle, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me do the pessimistic, optimistic thing. So, the metaphor there is that you have a horse race between three horses. And again, this reflects my extreme biases, and so I just had a very serious conversation with a young woman who's a very good scholar, young scholar coming up, who happens to be decidedly on the opposite side of things. And we were talking about priors and, whether or not, and I said, listen, I hope that I come off as someone who you would be able to knock me off my priors. And she says, you've been doing this for 30 years. There's no way that you would, you would give up on your priors. And I'm saying, okay, I admit that, but I said what I hope that I do is in my conversations with you, you could become convinced that you could knock me slightly off my priors. So like if you view my priors as my set of eyeglasses, you could like twist my eyeglasses, right? So that I'm like confused a little bit. I said that I hope that you think that I'm open enough to that, rather than the idea that these glasses are fixed and I can't change them. But, so I'm giving these essays, and, I'm trying to find metaphors to talk to you, sometimes academic audience, but sometimes broader. So I came up with this metaphor of why it is that I'm optimistic, even though I think there's so much that is broken in the world, and why I have optimism in the power of individuals, right? That giving ordinary citizens this freedom, and they can do extraordinary things. And so, to get technical, in economics, there's a factor productivity curve, right? And what I believe is that trade and technologies are two of the things that knock the curve up. So, you have a factor productivity curve that meets diminishing returns. You have a second one which now has increasing trade and increasing technology. So it's higher, but it still faces diminishing returns. And this is time on this axis and output on this axis. And then what you have is you have deviations against those trends, which are caused by various different disturbances to the trend by government policies. So, and what I'm trying to argue is that tomorrow's trough will be higher than today's peak as long as you allow trade and technology to continue to flourish. And so the way I describe this is a horse race between a Schumpeterian horse, which represents innovation, a Smithian horse, which represents gains from trade, and then a stupid horse, which represents government. Or right? And so what I want to do is I want to sort of run a horse race, and as long as stupid doesn't get ahead, and I use the 3 S's because that's for, but as long as the stupid horse doesn't get ahead, that tomorrow will be better than today. Okay. And so I'm pessimistically optimistic, right? Because I'm optimistic at the end of the day because you're going to be better off today. But what I'm worried about is if we attack trade and if we attack technology. And so protectionist legislation bugs me, and anti-technology initiatives bug me. Now, there's a lot missing in that conversation. One of the big things missing in that conversation is actually McCloskey. And I think that she should be part of that conversation, because the way we talk about trade and technology will affect our efforts to kill trade and technology, right? And so if we talk about, international and global trade as a emancipatory project, Collier or Deaton's book, right? So Deaton's book is the Great Escape, Great Escape from the Malthusian Trap, or the Collier book on the bottom billion being lifted up, right? These kind of ideas, or Easterly, who I have over here, and what markets bring, emancipation for people, opportunity, life, changes in their and whatnot. If I talk about trade that way, that's going to be different than if I talk about trade as, the thing that actually brings, destitute to people, and the global South is, and same thing with technology. If technology is not viewed as our thing that unleashes our ability to fight significant big hairy problems, global climate change or whatever, that what we need is technology to take care of that, and we need to unleash that rather than the idea that technology is the cause of all of that. When we talk that way, we're not going to be able to have those things. And so McCloskey is right 100% at the end of the day that all of these things turn on the way in which we talk to one another about the dignity associated with various activities. And so this is what I'm when I'm ending with the cosmopolitan liberal project and the idea of strangers nowhere in the world, and that means open borders and peace, non-interventionist in foreign affairs, basically non-discriminatory politics, all these kind of issues that I'm trying to talk about in that last chapter. Those are going to be, the sort of how we answer those is going to determine how we're going to live in the next 50 to 100 years. And I think that, if those factor productivity curves, if that rate of improvement falls because we kill trade and technology, tomorrow's trough can be lower than today's peak. Like you can do it in your head. You can just slightly lower what that is going on, and you could, all of a sudden now tomorrow's trough is going to be lower than today's peak, and we're not going to be better off tomorrow. We're going to leave a world for our kids which is poorer, more conflict prone, all of these other things. And so this is what I'm concerned with, and what I struggle with, and what I hope people will get out of the book is for themselves to jump into that. But I think, if I had to write it again, I think I would stress a little bit more at the end this McCloskey point about our language and the way that we communicate with one another and the way we talk about these issues as being, because I put a lot of stress on, the institutions. We have to get these institutions. And she raises a lot of questions about that. If I can...
In her review of the book.
Yeah, but also other places, right? But if I could just just take a short little bit, so I don't... So I'm not trying to be weaselly, and I worry about that I'm I don't want to engage in immunizing strategies. I want to actually, be right there for her to criticize and everything like that. But I think that the key issue for me is that when I think about institutions, I think about the formal and informal institutions, right? She's only thinking about the formal institutions. I think about all these informal institutions, the mores, norms. So in that sense, it's capturing, her aspects of her virtues are in the informal institutions. And I see the relationship between the formal and informal institutions, like in papers that I've written on stickiness and other kind of things, as related that I am talking in economistic language, that these raise or lower the enforcement costs. But those enforcement costs come in the form of formal enforcement, police and the courts and whatnot, but also informal enforcement in the form of social approbation and disapprobation, which is is in our talk. So I think I'm capturing McCloskey in my position in a way that she doesn't see I'm doing, right? Because she thinks I'm being too new institutionalist. But I don't think I'm being new institutionalist because I'm actually making, a big room for norms, mores, conventions, talk. I just don't say it as much as I should have said it. And if I was to say it again, I would end that last chapter doing that. But if you go back and look at that last chapter, I have a point in there about civility right before I get to the whole thing about the cosmopolitan liberal project. And to me, civility is about talk. So I think I was doing it, but I just missed, being explicit about it. But I argue that you need to have civility. And this goes back to your question about the Ostroms and Buchanan and the necessity of a self-governing democratic society, is I think we need to have civil discourse with one another in order for us to be able to overcome these sharp objects in our interactions, which could really prevent us from realizing the gains from trade and the benefits of innovation, because we get blocked because of these sharp objects. So we have to dull them, and part of that dulling is learning how to talk with one another as dignified equals in a civil manner. And I think that McCloskey is, 100% right, that, the ideas, the way we think, the way we see the world has to change. And right now, we're seeing the world in a very zero-sum kind of way, and we need to start seeing it in non-zero-sumness again.
Okay, so at the end of the book, the final sensation I got was there's hope for a better world. So I was more optimistic than pessimistic in a sense. So to conclude, Professor Boettke, thank you so much for this interview. It's been great.
I greatly appreciate it. I'm sorry if I'm long-winded on some of my answers. I really, love this project. I love the scholarship the journey that I've been on, starting from, studying the Soviet system.
It's an amazing journey.
And I really, love doing it. And I love wrestling with, people like Jeff and others who, challenge us at a fundamental level to rethink how we, examine political economy. And I hope that the economics profession, that struggle that I share with Jeff, and with Deidre and so many others, that the economics profession will be, at the end of the day, more enriched by it rather than impoverished by having this more open conversation.
It will.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's a wonderful story, and there is hope, as I said, for a better world.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All righty.